Hi, I'm Jim, and what I want to do this evening is read you a few extracts from my novella, Vessel. Atop that hill used to sit a giant ship. It was like a wooden egg cracked open at the summit of the world. My family, under Father's leadership, built it, and within it we escaped a raging sea that covered the whole earth. When we disembarked, we were to fill the world again. It was to be a new beginning. It was supposed to be a new life, and in a way it was, as when I try to remember life before the flood. It feels as if I am seeing the memories of another man, as if somebody else had inhabited my body in that time. How can I begin my story any place but after the flood? You may be aware that many ancient cultures around the world have flood narratives, and that's really interesting to me, is that we as a species return to this story, this narrative of a flood, to try and explain ourselves and our nature to ourselves. And in a way, this is kind of, a modern attempt to do that. Being within the familiar confines of the tent felt like returning home. Once we were inside, we could imagine that we had stepped into the past, and that we were back in our native land. We could pretend that the flood was still just a moniker for an event so far in the future that none of us could really fathom it. If only I could reclaim the ignorance I had then, when the flood was just a word. Flood. It is an appropriate word to describe that water. It is a short word, definite. It falls quickly from the mouth. It sounds solid and firm like a cliff face, and in a way, a cliff is what the flood has become. It is a cut in the flow of history, and nothing can pass from one side to the other. Because of the flood, we are forced to begin again. I wish the word flood were not so impassable. I wish it spoke of something other than its own strength. In the future, people will remember the flood, and they'll talk about the water covering the earth, but will they remember the people that were lost? That memory has been cut off by the sublime terror of the flood itself. The word flood will become only a word once more. No one will be able to comprehend just what it was and what it has done. It's told from dual perspectives. One perspective being Noah, who is pious and sort of right thinking, and the other perspective being that of one of his sons, Ham, who his natural thing is to kind of reject all that stuff. One of the major themes of the novel is thinking about what do we inherit from the past. And how do we look to our own past? And one of the places that is addressed and discussed is in a moment where Ham is holding his newborn son for the first time. I was alone with my son for the first time soon after his birth. Once he had fed in his mother's arms, my mother took Nisa away so that she could wash. Abichail attended to her, and I was left to cradle the child in my arms. He had a thatch of dark hair and chubby limbs. Mother said the child was healthy. Nisa's poor diet during pregnancy had not seemed to impede his growth. When he was born, I used the knife I had found in the caves to cut his cord and placed him in his mother's arms. He knew by instinct how to latch to her breast, and when I held him, a reflex told him to grip the finger I offered his delicate hand. Where did those impulses come from? They did not have to be taught, they were innate. They were resident inside of him, a kind of knowledge that was pure. He had that knowledge from the womb. But how had it arrived? Who put it there? I used to think that all knowledge must be taught or learned by experience, but in my son I saw that an understanding of certain things that were good and useful to his development breathed within him. The knowledge that came from the fruit joined Adam to toil and death. Yet another kind of knowledge that has its source hidden in our origin joins us to life. It is seen in the knowledge an infant has to draw milk from the breast. And that theme, and thinking about Adam and that kind of thing, comes up later. I guess if you know the story it's based on, you already know that this happens. Noah gets drunk. He ends up passing out naked in his tent, and the way that his sons react to that, and the way that Noah reacts to the way they react when he comes to, is it's interesting. So this is Ham. I didn't see him at first, sleeping there on the floor, sprawled prone in the central living area amongst strewn mats and slung winter clothes. He was smaller. His stature was diminished. Nakedness had robbed him of his dignity, and that dignity was really all Noah ever had. Seeing him that way, he was no longer the great Noah. He was revealed to be nothing more than a man as wretched as any other. Thoughts came in clusters. Firstly, I was thrilled at the notion of telling Shem how I had found father. It would kill him. I could imagine how he'd take it to hear that the one God had set apart had debased himself and showed himself to be undeserving. I'd tell Shem how the righteous father he defended had dissipated and only a sleeping sinner remained. If the flood was a test, he'd failed. His status as God's chosen and righteous man was undressed. It was laid down to die by his sin. He slept, but he would wake a guilty man, and I would be his loudest accuser. I almost laughed then and there right in front of him. But a second thought came, this one more solemn. It grew as I gazed upon my sleeping father. It crept over me like the claustrophobic atmosphere in the tent. Noah's humanity had been laid bare along with his body. He was a man descended from other men. He was frail. I saw it then, and I saw the flesh from which I was conceived. That small sack of skin behind his penis that held my origin, flesh from flesh. Somewhere in his frailty and nakedness, I saw something that I'd been searching for, a connection to the past. It was there in my father, and had been passed through him to me. There was a thread that led back, or that dragged the old world through into the present. We carried it, and the past remained with us. Perhaps it is a sorrowful thought to me now, but at that moment I was comforted. I was not truly cut off from the world that I had known and had learned to live in. All my thoughts were wordless, experienced as feelings rather than anything I could have uttered. The comforting realization that we possessed a link to the past within ourselves became symbolized in the sight of his loins. The fruit of my father's loins would be men and women who would live their own lives, build their own cities and towers, and restore the lost achievements of man. We would strike out and make our own way apart from God again, like we did once before. There would be others like me, others not content to live under the rule of this God. That is what would come from Noah, the drunk, the naked, and the fearful. I saw it clearly, because the loins from which all future generations would come also contained all the family traits of those who came before. In the sight of my origin, I saw Adam's hand reaching out for the fruit.